and I will be moderating a panel on superheroes, how they get their powers, and pretty much everything to do with superpowers in a superpowered universe. Joining me today are these 5 wonderful superhero authors, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. CB, go first, then Samantha, then Karen, then Michael, then Lucas.
Okay, I am CB Wright, also known as the self-publishing supervillain. I write the Curveball web serial and series of novels. You can see that over at curveball.xyz. And that is all I have to say at this point.
Hi, I'm Samantha Bryant. I write the Menopausal Superhero series brought to you by Falstaff Books. That's currently 3 novels and 2 novellas, with 1 more novella due out this year and then a novel next year and the year after. And I'm hoping to be done with the series then, because I have other things I want to write too.
Hey, I am Karen Diem. I am the author of the Arca superhero urban fantasy series following the adventures of Zeta Garcia, who, well, let's just say she's not the most knowledgeable of superheroes. I have 5 books out. The 5th book just released this month in the series, and I'm working on book 6. If you are interested in my books, you can find them at karendiem.com.
I'm Michael Bailey. I'm a working writer with 22 years experience. I'm the author of the Action Figures Young Adult Superhero series. Book 9 just came out a couple months back. I'm working on book 10, get a couple more before the series wraps. And then the other stuff I write at innsmouthlook.com. And tagging off to Lucas.
Yeah, my name's Lucas Flint. I write mostly young adult superhero books, although I've occasionally ventured into lit RPG recently. And you can mostly find my books at www.lucasflint.com. And I'm also going to be running a Kickstarter at the end of the month for an audiobook adaptation of my first superhero book called The Superhero's Test. And I've written a lot of superhero books. I lost count after 30, I think. So, happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming and joining us today. And also thank you to superherofiction.com for hosting this, because it's pretty amazing. Check out their website for all the awesome superhero action. I think almost all of our books are on there. So the first question I have for you 5 brilliant people is, how do you create the origin of your superpowers? And by that I mean is, with Marvel and DC, they have this huge advantage of 70 years of continuity to draw upon. And when Spider-Man got bit by a radioactive spider, nobody said that's not how physics works. We have a very discerning audience these days, and they'll accept superpowers, but the moment your superhero breaks the laws of physics, they're on you like white on rice. So how do you deal with the creation of superpowers in your world and in your universe? And we'll go the same direction that we went, CB, then Samantha, Karen, Michael, Lucas. Okay? Go ahead.
Well, I personally haven't found a lot of objection to origins and how powers work in terms of plausibility. I get a lot of pushback when I do something like get gun physics wrong. There was an issue where I had a gun fail to fire because it was submerged in water, and I was inundated by like 500 emails immediately linking to the same YouTube video of a gun being fired underwater, for example.
Well, any response is a good response.
That's true, but after a while I was like, yes, I've seen the video, yes, I know I was wrong. But in terms of actual superpowers, I think, there is an element of audience that wants more explanation and background into that. That's certainly true. But to a certain extent, I think that I'm able to inherit the bitten by radioactive spider advantage that DC and Marvel have created for the rest of us. I have, 4 different kinds of origin stories for powers in my universe. There are tech guys, there are people who just have it genetically. There's a kind of magic, and then there are people who just have powers with no explanation, and that's a story point. I deliberately don't explain why it exists, and I think that my theory is the only thing that you have to do to get away with something that you write is to get the audience to buy in. And the way I try to get them to buy in is I try to work the origin. I try to make the origin affect how the power works and how it affects the character who has it. I'm not saying that I, succeed all the time, but I do think that, origin informs character. And if you can get the reader to buy into the character, then you can pretty much do anything you want. All you have to get them to do is say, okay, sure.
Awesome, CV. That's an excellent explanation. I like the idea of like, they're just going to be superpowers, and you're just going to accept that. And we're not going to get into why they're superpowers.
The genre comes with a certain expectation of leaping tall buildings in a single bound.
So, Trish, I'll get to Trish's question in just a minute. I want to finish this one first. Trish has a question, and it's a good one. Samantha, can you tell us how you do powers?
So I always call it as I just use a bit of hand wavium. I don't worry too much, and like CB said, I don't really get pushback from fans about not having come up with a deep scientific sounding explanation for how people ended up with powers. In my series, it's the menopausal superhero series. So the thing that unites all of these heroes is that they are women going through menopause, who then all used, I'll call non-prescription treatments, things that you might pick up at a farmer's market, something herbal, that kind of thing, to try to deal with some of their symptoms. And I've gone with unexpected side effects is how we ended up with powers for the most part. And, if you get into the series, you find out a little bit about where these products came from and how they have a connection. But I went with unexpected side effects. And then the fun part for me is trying to make the powers symbolic of the issues the characters are going through. And so like one character who is suffering from depression took a tea to lighten, she drank tea to lighten her mood and ended up lightening all of her. As in, the way she puts it is she renegotiated her contract with gravity. And so now she floats and then eventually learns to control it to be real flight.
Awesome. That's terrific. I really like that. Again, it's the whole, you're just going to accept their superpowers, and I can really get on board with that. Karen, how about you?
Oh, well, I just kind of threw everything at the wall and waited to see what stuck. So obviously my powers are from magical, vampiric, rutabaga space gods. Just kidding. I
Needs to be a title of a book.
I was with you till you said rutabaga. Then I was like, huh.
Well, vegetables. You got to get the right vegetables in your diet. And I feel like that is an avenue that Marvel and DC have not explored completely. So it was free. That whole rutabaga space, I'm willing to offer that to anyone listening who wants to use that for their own explanation. As far as the actual origins, my series is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, so I deliberately call on some superhero tropes. So, of course, everyone who has powers in my universe at some point fell into a coma of varying lengths. How long their coma was actually depended on, what powers they got and that sort of thing. And I'm still trickling out the explanations for it. I do have like a whole scientific thing that sort of makes sense from a physics perspective. But I am relying on the fact that, tongue-in-cheek, superhero history of radioactive spider is good enough.
That's awesome. If I recall, because I've read a couple of your books, part of the first book you have is Zika dealing with getting the powers and being like in quarantine or something, right?
Yes, everybody who fell into the what I refer to as the spontaneous coma. The U.S. reaction to that was to quarantine as many of them as they could find. And some places that was a shelter
How
in
apropos.
place.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was years ago, mind you, before all this. So some places did shelter in place. Zeta happened to be in a major metropolitan area, the DC area, and she ended up in the stereotypical creepy hospital filled with other quarantined people. So yeah, there was the quarantine aspect, and then the government said, "Yeah, you guys, we don't know what happened to you and why some of you are now like weird. So just stay in quarantine for a few more months." And that was one of the challenges in the first book. I mean, most of the first book was kind of the origin story, and like first adventure, getting to know your powers without actually doing a montage, because that's a little difficult to do in a book. You just can't get the soundtrack right.
Doing a montage is one of the toughest things I've done, trying to figure out how to do it in Wraith, because there's a training montage that lasts a chapter. And it ended up being like the funnest chapter I've ever written. So I get that totally. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that. That's terrific. Michael, how about you?
I get a lot of dirty looks when I say this. I am not big into advanced world building with my writing. I'm very much a pantser rather than a planner. So when I started writing, went forward with the idea that this was a pre-existing superhero universe. It had the 11 source of superhuman being genetic mutation, technology, magic / supernatural, and then people who were just very, very good at what they did, just naturally, physically, or intellectually talented, because I went under the assumption that people who would be interested in a superhero book are coming in pre-invested in the world. They know what a superhero world is. They know what to expect, and it's only the joyless fanboys who are going to get that hung up on how everything works. As long as you give them good characters and a good story, they'll roll with the big ideas. I think CB hit it on the head that your bigger threat is screwing on the more grounded real world details. That's the stuff people will call out immediately. That disrupts their suspension of disbelief more than anything a character can do, even if it seems ludicrous.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. That sounds pretty cool. I like like I said, seems like we've got a motif going on here with just accept that there are superpowers and let's move on. Lucas, you're up.
I will
go
add
ahead.
real fast. I might not have gone quite as in depth in figuring out why my superhero powers manifested in the book series. If it weren't for Mr. DM going, but why? Why do they have these powers? How are you framing the powers? And just wanting to not have that issue come up every time I have a new book and go, hey, honey, look, I have a new book.
That's awesome. Yeah, my wife is incredibly helpful with my writing as well. Lucas, how about you?
Yeah, I guess my answer is pretty similar to what a lot of y'all have already said about it's like it's a superhero book, superhero world. The powers are kind of there. I mean, like in one of my series, I had that it's like genetic, like you're born with superpowers or you're not, or another one's might be like taking a drug to get powers or something like that. But I don't get too sciencey about it. I don't go too much in depth on that. But I agree with Michael that like I'm more of a pantser. than a plotter or a pre-planner or anything like that. And so, well, I do like to do some world building and stuff before I start writing a story. Also, we'll just make up a lot of stuff as I go as well. It's not a big, I don't worry about it too much. I already know it's already kind of like super, like let's say also superheroes are just kind of inherently, just that way. I think most readers are okay with a token explanation, even if it's not 100%, super like based in real science. Although I guess it'd be interesting if you could do something like that. Like I'm not scientific enough to pull off something like that, but someone who could make like a hard sci-fi superhero series or something could be interesting.
Well, thank you, Lucas. That's pretty cool. I wish I could go more in depth about the way I did it, because I kind of wanted to have that same feeling of Marvel and DC, like powers have always existed.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way I could think of to do that was to do sort of an alternate history Earth, so that like Tesla had an experiment and it went wrong, and that's when Superpowers started in 1903 when he turned on Wardenclyffe Tower. However, I tie that later into the book series, so spoilers. I won't get into it, but it's neat when you have like going into the story. I'm a pantser as well, and I just sort of started writing, and I was like, oh hey, wouldn't it be neat if this thing had happened? And then I put in Tesla's name there, and then like I think book 3 or book 4 is when I start really getting into it. We got 2 questions so far. I think I'm going to save Trish's for the last, because it's a pretty. I want some good answers on that one. It's pretty heavy duty. Scott asks, does anybody have a hero villain shared origin of their powers? In other words, the hero and the villain get the same. They have their powers for the same reason.
Yeah, that's definitely right at the heart of my series, because I'm not very good at black and white. Here are the villains over here. Here are the heroes over here, kind of thing. And I, in the Menopausal Superhero series, in the first book, the villain is the mad scientist, who creates the powers by accident, and she also experiments on herself. So, she ends up with some strange things happening to her that are related to the strange things that happen to everybody else. And that's interesting because I liked that in a storytelling way, because it binds the antagonist and the protagonist together, that they both are invested in understanding and solving the problem of what these, I also went with, they weren't necessarily all a boon. It's not like, yay, I can fly now. It's more like, oh crap, I can't stay on the ground now. And, I wanted to be younger, but not quite this much younger, and those kinds of things become problems for them to solve, and they need each other. So it keeps pushing them back into each other's worlds and giving me a lot of great conflict to interact with. So it makes it a lot of fun for the writer.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks, Samantha. Appreciate that. Anybody else have a hero and a villain with a shared origin story?
Everybody in my series has the same reason for their powers. If nothing else, that allows the series to more naturally ramp up, because the villains are learning their powers mostly too. I do have at least one previous wave of people with powers, and as of the first book, my main character thinks they're all dead. So there might be some more powerful people lurking in the wings, but this way I don't have to have somebody start out with, here's a super experienced supervillain, and here's this person who can't stop herself from turning into a chicken. Trying to deal with it.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, Karen, because that's actually the plot of my first ever book I wrote. Was the main villain was really experienced and adult. The hero was a teenager just learning how to use his powers. But so that was kind of funny. But yeah, like in my Neoverse stories, all super characters are superheroes or villains or whatever. Powers are genetic in that setting, so they all pretty much have the same origin, regardless of who they are. And I guess in another series I did in my Legacy Superhero series, the main character and the antagonist both got their powers basically from their costumes. Although their costumes came from different sources. So I've done that before. It can be fun.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing, Lucas. I appreciate that. That's good information. All right, moving on to our next question. When you are creating a hero who has superpowers or some ability to affect superpowers, for instance, Arsenal doesn't have any superpowers, but she has a suit of advanced technology armor that affects superpowers. How do you approach building their powers? Do you build the character around the powers, or do you make the character first and then add the powers? Are the powers, inherently tied to the character's personality? How do you do that?
And I would argue that Arsenal's superpower is her brain. She's a little off the normal charts there, Jeff.
Okay, a little bit, but so is Tony Stark, and he doesn't have superpowers. I'm very specific about that in the books, however, that she doesn't have superpowers. Right. Everybody keeps trying to say all of her accomplishments are because she has superpowers, and I'm really big on heroes earning their achievements. They have to earn their powers, and they have to sacrifice for their victories. And so I try to give heroes powers that have to do with how they're created. So how do you folks handle that?
It varies.
Character first, always. I think again, sort of not really battling, but taking a more measured approach to it. I think when you can overthink something like that, not writing your stories to fit the powers the characters have, rather than just give the characters something that interests you and makes you excited. It's like I have a conversation with the writers a lot. They spend a lot of time on world building and forget about character and story, and their stories end up being just a chance to show off all the world building they did. I've seen that in a few superhero books. They put a lot of thought into the superpowers, and everything is geared towards showing them off, or they've given someone such a specific power that at some point in the story you go, oh, this person is going to be necessary to achieve this plot, and it's a little boring, a little cliche, and delectable. As long as you're giving them characters and good stories, the powers are almost incidental if you're doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
True. I mean, obviously, people come for the story and they stay for the character, and this is kind of how books work. While there are some people who do love world building, and that's why they read books, I think the vast majority of people get attached to characters. Because if you think about movies and books that you love, you don't think about like whatever the Bourne Identity's plot problem was. You think about how awesome Jason Bourne was. So that's definitely a way to go there. I was thinking more along the lines sometimes like you come up with like a really cool idea for a superpower, because there's lots of Supergirls and Superman and Batman and whatnot. I don't want to say knockoffs, but heroes with those power sets. I remember a review I read, I think on Super, Karen, that said that they were really amazed that it had a hero with the shape-shifting powers, because you don't see that very often. And so that was pretty interesting. And I wondered, like, did the power come first, or did you come up with the character first?
For me, it's always character first. Every time. Character first. And for my people, tiny bit spoilery, but everybody's powers depend a lot on that person's personality. So Zeta was this, extreme sports action junkie, always on the move, always wanting to swim, jump off it, climb higher, go faster, do everything. So, shape-shifting teleporter totally made sense for her. On the other hand, her librarian friend, who was a devout Wiccan and kind of nosy, telepathic witch worked for her better. For another character, her power is basically that for limited times she can make cartoon physics apply. I have a character whose special power is when she bakes a pie, it makes mental illness go away for a while. because that's what she wanted to do more than anything, because she had
Can
a
I
son
have some
come
of that
home.
pie?
Yeah, she had a son come home from the war with PTSD. And like any mom, she wanted to make it better for her kids. And that was a huge part of her personality. And that's how the Pie Lady came to be. So I have a pretty wide range of powers, and it's all based on the different characters and what made sense to me based on that character. Um, I do, since I do lean on tropes purposefully, it's a plot point, have the Superman, Supergirl type of powers on certain people too. Um, it's far too silly to think that there aren't people who really want to be Superman or what have you. And I'm into silly, but I'm into purposeful silly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. Appreciate that. Does anybody else have like a different answer, or does everybody pretty much the same of character first, and then you come up with powers that match the character?
No, I come from entirely the opposite direction.
Oh, good.
So I've got some where like the year one of Curveball opens with the Captain Airsats of Captain America getting murdered. So I start with archetypes, and then later on in that year, his great granddaughter finds out that she basically has the same power set. So one of the main characters continues with the has the equivalent of the superhero soldier serum running through her body. I start with the power set, and then I want to see what I can do with it, and I try to make it unique and make the character unique too as a reflection of that. So, but the best example I have for that is I have a character whose power is he can be in 6 different places at the same time, and he's very insistent that it is not creating copies of himself. He is actually in 6 different places at the same time instead of making duplicates of himself. But his actual power, according to everyone who knows him, is that he's really good at being a jerk, because he can just get under people's skin and get them to lose their cool and stuff like that. And so, I started with what I thought was a really interesting take on Multiple Man, it being sort of a quantum version of Multiple Man, where you're actually taking up more than one place in space simultaneously. But then the thing that actually made him interesting after that was that he was basically the jackass on the good guy team.
Thank you so much, CB. Appreciate that. How about you, Samantha?
I actually, for this particular series, it works differently for me depending on what I'm writing. But for this particular series, I actually started with menopause and looking at list of different menopausal complaints that people have, and reimagining how those might how I could flip those into superpowers. And so, like, the most famous complaint that like everybody knows about, even if when I say the word menopause, you get the Wiggins, is about hot flashes, right? So, thinking about somebody having hot flashes, and I developed kind of at the same time a person and somebody with a power set then that went with that symptom. So Helen had hot flashes, and it developed into the ability to actually wield fire, like to make her heat external and use it. And she also is the most hot-tempered and untrustworthy person to have been handed such things. She could be quite destructive. Definitely not the person you want to make angry, because she'll use it against you, and she's not necessarily hemmed in by ideas of whether she should or not. And, another character had the dry, itchy skin, and it developed into like scaly, bulletproof armor. So I started with a list of symptoms, and then kind of people with powers grew out of that, which was, I thought, kind of fun.
That is really original. Wow, that's pretty cool. I like that. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question here. So, what kind of limitations do you all build into your powers? To give you an example, I don't know if you've all read Wearing the Cape by Marion G. Harmon.
Yes.
kind of one of the original independent superhero authors. He published that back in 2011. And all of his characters had sort of like a universal limitation. He called it rock, paper, scissors. You know, the Supergirl types were great until they ran into somebody who could, freeze them solid. Or, and the freezy people were great until they ran into a fire elemental, that kind of thing. Do you folks have any kind of limitations built into your powers in any way? Samantha, why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, I do. I try to. It's funny what you say when you're talking about superpowers, but I try to deal with superpowers realistically, like imagining that they could exist. What would that really mean in your life? And so I have like somebody who develops super strength and has to learn not to crush things accidentally, and it's not instant, and there's a learning curve, and it's throughout the different stories, he doesn't know how strong. They don't know how strong they are. They don't know if I go and try to pick this up, am I going to die? Because I don't know what my limits actually are. So, the characters are discovering their limits alongside me as the reader and writer, and giving them their control. Like my girl who flies, Fly Girl, she wasn't good at it at first. When it first happened to her, it was like she tripped and just didn't fall. And she didn't know how to get back down after she didn't fall. So she's up in the rafters of her house, bouncing against the chandelier, trying to figure out how to get back down. So I stick with mostly a real world setting with these superpowers in, and I try to treat the superpowers what feels realistically to me in the setting.
Mm-hmm. Excellent answer. Well done. Anybody else have an answer to that question about limitations?
Yeah, I've got a couple of examples I can think of from some of my series, like with my Capes Online series, which is a superhero lit RPG like crossover, so it's got lit RPG elements. So what I set up is that in the game system, all player characters have to draw upon their energy. Like they don't have like limitless energies. Like every power they use uses a certain amount of like energy points. Sort of like mana or magic in a video game or something like that. And so if they run out of that energy, then they have to find a way to refill it in order to use their powers again. Or their powers have certain cooldown periods, like they can unleash a super big powerful attack, but then they can't use it for a few hours or a day or something like that. So there's got be limits on how to use, or if they do, there might be some really bad status debuff that'll make them like really weak for a while or something. So there's that. In a series that I'm writing that I haven't published yet, but the first book's going to come out later this summer, the main character's powers actually hurt her because she's suffering from a genetic disorder that makes it so that every time she uses her powers, it hurts her body some more. So she has to deal with, not using her powers too much. Otherwise, she risks actually killing herself. And that's one of the central conflicts for the series. And part of her character is, learn how to deal with that and find a cure and stuff. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Lucas. Appreciate that input. That's kind of a neat idea, the whole you've got powers, but they're killing you. That's kind of a cool built-in limitation. Anybody else have an answer for limitations on superpowers?
My biggest limitation for the superpowers in my universe is that you can only break the laws of the physical world if it is something that applies to your powers. So yes, you could be immune to bullets, but you still have to breathe. I have one character who is a shapeshifter. She had a bad heart to start out with. Well, in her case, a little like Lucas's character, shapeshifting is too hard on her, and it sends her into a heart attack. So she's actually one of my more extreme examples. But yeah, you cannot break the laws of physics unless it's your superpower. In which case, have fun with that.
Awesome. That's terrific. Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. How do you all differentiate between powers that are similar? One thing I noticed, it took me a few books to get there, But one thing I noticed was proliferance of punchy, shooty powers. And I remember when Joss Whedon was interviewed about Age of Ultron, they asked why he picked Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Other than the obvious, which was they were the first other people to join the Avengers besides Hawkeye, and he was already an Avenger. And that was because he said their powers weren't punchy. And that being like, they don't shoot energy blasts, they don't punch people. And after a while, writing people with punchy powers, it gets a little boring. How do you alleviate that? How do you do it differently?
I mean, I hate to disagree with Joss Whedon, but when Quicksilver punches you at 50 times the speed of sound, you're being punched.
Well, he also breaks every bone in his hand because he's not, invulnerable.
Yeah. I think one way I've done it with my series is the character, like their personality, and they're like two characters might have the same personality, but or the same power or similar powers, but they may have like different personalities. Like again, for my Capes Online series, the main character is Winter. He has ice-based powers, and I have a lot of ice-based characters in my stories, and I think about it, but he's more direct, like he can shoot ice beams and stuff from his hand, but he's more into like getting like up and melee, like he'll get like weapons and stuff and just be more willing to fight people up front, like create daggers made of ice or gloves, like boxing gloves made of ice or something like that. Whereas in another series, I have a character named Blizzard who she's less, she has ice-based powers, but she is more about like shooting ice beams or creating snowstorms or something like that, and is not as physically oriented. I mean, she can do physical fighting just fine, but it's like she's more into using her powers to like attack from a distance or control the environment basically. So because that's part of their personalities and how they who they are as characters and how they choose to use their powers and stuff. So
awesome. Well, that's actually how they use their powers is a big way to differentiate it. Anybody else?
I'm very much in agreement with Lucas that personality can be the factor that makes two characters with identical power sets very different. It's like watching two MMA fights go at it. Their personalities dictate their approaches. Some fight much more calculating, some just charge in, throwing fists, rapid fire. They're a lot of times the same basic style, same foundations, but their personalities dictate if they are more aggressive, more thoughtful. I know in the Green Lantern Rebirth series, there was this whole like 2-page where they're showing how Hal Jordan, Jon Stewart, Guy Gardner, and Kyle Rayner are all essentially the same character, but they all have very different approaches to how they use their power rings. You let personality drive how the powers are used. You can have a whole team of people with the exact same powers, but they could be using them in very, very different ways, and that's how they all stand out.
Excellent. That's a valid point. Samantha, Karen?
This one hasn't come up for me so much yet. I keep my cast fairly small. There were 4 main characters in the first book, and here at the end of the third, I'm still only up to about 7. So
I need to do that. I keep adding characters.
Yeah. So even with adding powered villains and that kind of thing, I haven't really had to repeat myself so much yet. I did have in one of the novels, there was kind of a group of villains that all had in common that they had psychic related powers, but they didn't all have the same one. Like this one could do this one could do that, and they worked together as a team, which made them very hard to fight. I think though what everybody's saying about who the person is going to make all the difference in what they thought of to do with that. Even though both of us can make fire, maybe I decide to roll mine into balls and throw them at you, whereas somebody else uses it to superheat the ice you're standing on and melts it and drops you into the lake. It's we can use the same thing very differently depending on just what our strategy and attitude towards life is.
That's kind of the route I took. I've seen the regular shooty, punchy power things done really well. I've played in a lot of D&D and other campaigns where the whole punchy, shooty thing was pretty much the main point of most characters. So I kind of designed my series so that they wouldn't be able to just punchy, shooty their way out of everything. I mean, my main character, she's a shapeshifter. She's actually a very powerful shapeshifter in some respects, but she wasn't in it for the power, so she's got a lot of flexibility and range in what she can do, versus another shapeshifter in the series who was more about the personal power. So he's got like the werewolf healing package. He's got the man-wolf power fighting form. He's got all that stuff. And, you know, here's my character who's like, well, I could turn into an armadillo or a rhino or a crane, or I'm not doing a chicken right now. No, not in front of a predator. Thank you. You know, so I've got to make her work for her wins, because she's not the most powerful toe-to-toe combatant on any playing field. I mean, even physically, her non-superpowers, she's an excellent fighter, but she's 5'0" and small build. She tried to kick a really big guy once and bounced off him because he was too big, and that move does not work when they're that much bigger than you. One of my secondary characters, instead of letting her do the typical witch shooting a blast of magic at somebody, she doesn't believe it's right to use magic to fight like that or to cause harm to another. It goes against the Wiccan Rede. Do as you will, and it harm none. So she will not use her magic to do that, and her magic does not develop in that path. She can shield, she can heal, she can do a bunch of other stuff. But, you know, so I like to use it to challenge my characters. The ones that do have like the super strength and stuff like that, they're generally having to hold back so that they can at least attempt not to crack the overpass when they get tossed into it. You know, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering that. Yeah, I like that. The whole, especially in a fight, mass wins. That's the theme in my books too. So that's really cool that you do that. Anybody else? CB, I don't think you've answered. Do you have any kind of born-in limitations with your powers?
What I like to do is I like to take like the same power set and contrast it with other people who have essentially the same thing, but there are variations. And the best example for that are teleporters. I've got a few different teleporters in the story, and you know there are differences in like one guy can take other people with him when he ports, and he's rather unique in that respect. Most teleporters are restricted with problems of velocity, things like, you know, if you're falling off the side of a building and then you teleport to the ground, you're still retaining the velocity that you had whenever you but there's one guy who sheds his velocity or adapts to velocity whenever he teleports, and so he can survive stuff like that. And that really pisses every other teleporter off as soon as they find out about that. Stuff like that. The strong guys. There are some people who are all strong, all who are very strong and invulnerable. There are some guys who are, not just guys. There are some who are not as strong but more invulnerable, and also they heal. There's one character whose ability to heal is so complete and total that he can actually die, but then he comes back. So, you know, and I think of it all as the same kind of thing. They're all strong types, they're all physical types, but the way that manifests is different. So that's what I like to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's I like how you address that, the different types and stuff, having their own limitations built in. That's pretty cool. Okay, we're gonna move on to the bonus round, the final question for the evening, and it's a doozy. So prepare yourself. And I'm not being sarcastic. Trisha asks, and I'm going to modify it a little bit just because I think I know what she's getting at the heart of, but I'll ask it verbatim and then I'll tell you what I think she's asking. How are folks altering the expected gender expectations with women having passive powers and men having active powers? There's some history behind this question. So if you're not familiar, and I think you probably are all familiar with Marvel Comics of the 80s, DC never really did this because they always had Wonder Woman and Supergirl, but Marvel Comics of the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, especially with the X-Men, tended to have a lot of characters like Phoenix, who had mental powers, Kitty Pryde, who could phase, that kind of thing. And then the men all had like claw powers and shooty powers and, Colossus and strength powers. I noticed when I first started reading superhero fiction, when I first discovered it, that it was a thing outside of Marvel and DC in the book world in 2011, was that a lot of the books were either Supergirl or Iron Man. And they were good books, don't get me wrong. But one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to have the high-tech hero who was the girl and, kind of break that a little bit because all I had seen up to that point were the Iron Man types. So in your own books, is this an issue? Is this something you address? Is this, do you look at gender when you're talking about superpowers? How do you handle that?
I didn't. I don't really think about it too much. I see characters, whatever interesting, powers. They, if I think a power to go with a character, then they'll get that regardless of whether they're male or female or whatever. Like, I think if it's an interesting power and it fits the character, then I'll just do that. So I don't really think in terms of, like gendering stuff, although sometimes I might adjust like the gender ratio in my book. So I feel like I'm leaning too much one way or another, like maybe introduce some more female characters, or have too many male characters, or too many, or vice versa or whatever. But that's as far as I get in terms of like actively thinking about it. So
for this is a big thing, of course, in the menopausal superhero series, because one of my jokes about the book is that it fails a reverse Bechdel test. There are almost no men in the book, and if they are, they're here to talk about the women. I think for something like this, I've pretty much just looked at it and ignored it. Since all the powered characters are female, then there's no question about which powers are for females and which powers are for males. And I do have one male, or seemingly male, menopausal superhero, but he's only been male since the beginning of the first book. But for the first 48 years of his life, he was Latina.
Okay, that's an interesting hook. Thank you so much, Samantha. How about you, the rest of you? CB, Michael, Karen?
What?
I don't know. Personally, I don't. I'm with Lucas that the gender is irrelevant. The powers belong to the characters, regardless of whether they're men, women, non-binary. And I don't know if I'd necessarily. I mean, Trish and I have some pretty good discussions on Facebook about stuff like this on occasion. I don't know if I'd necessarily agree that the women heroes, as a rule, have passive powers, or especially nowadays, if that's the expectation. When I think of women superheroes, I'm thinking about Wonder Woman, Captain Marvel. Their powers are very active. She-Hulk. I don't know if that's an expectation necessarily, especially these days with audiences more savvy and more accepting. And I think the expectation is that men and women characters are going to be on a more level playing field, and they aren't going to play into those. I think if writers are falling into that trap, it's because they're coming at it from a very outdated perspective.
I can kind of see some of that, though. I mean, when I think of the classic passive character from the Marvel era. I think of the Invisible Girl from the Fantastic Four. But the thing that always frustrated me about that is her power set isn't what I would consider passive. It's how she was written during a specific length of time. I haven't read Fantastic Four lately, so that may not even be the case anymore. But for a specific length of time, she turned invisible and she used her force field powers to protect people, and that was kind of a passive, traditionally, stereotypically feminine heroic role at that point in time. And when I would think about all of the all of the offense-based things you can do with being able to project force fields, especially at the strength that she has, I mean, I would consider her potentially second only to the Human Torch in terms of offensive capability for the Fantastic Four specifically. I mean, she would just be able to tear people limb from limb. That would violate the comics code, obviously, but there's just a power set is passive if you write it passive, but I would be hard pressed to find even Kitty Pryde. I mean, okay, she phases, but she can phase through people and solidify herself as she's doing it. She did that with a few Sentinels, as I recall, never human beings, because again, comics code. But whether or not something is passive or active depends on how you write it, how you portray it.
That's a very good point.
In my world,
Yeah.
there's a character who basically, she's a flame projector, and her ability to generate overpressure is so great that she knocked the tip off of an island during a fight. And the most passive power that I've introduced is there's the guy who's the head of the federal division, whose power is he can always detect lies. And that's essentially the extent of his power, which is pretty passive, although extremely useful if you're a federal agent. I just think it depends on what choices you make when you have someone decide to use a power, whether or not it is more passive or more active. And I think a great, there are good reasons to do both. I mean, going back to the example of the magic character who doesn't believe in using power offensively. I mean, that's, I suppose you could consider that more passive, but it is a solid and good and interesting and compelling character choice. But I do think that that there was a time in comic bookdom when female characters, regardless of whatever power they had, they used it passively. And I think that the difference is you can find it doesn't have to be that way. It's just the choice that was made, and when you make that choice all the time instead of some of the times, then it's not good.
Yeah, it was mostly with like the X-Men and, like you said, the Fantastic Four in the 80s, early 90s, late 70s, that era. I never noticed it until someone pointed it out to me, but I'm not a woman, clearly. So I can see why you would notice that and look through the comments and go, hey, why are all these characters that are female have this sort of powers and all the characters that are male have these sort of powers? Now, I don't think that's the case now, but this is 2020, not 1980.
Right, we've got plenty of punchy punch, fighty fight women out there now.
Yeah, everybody's punchy punch, fighty fight. They've gotten rid of all the characters who sit around and try to talk through their problems.
See, I actually, part of the reason I did the witch was because she's a more traditionally feminine character. She contrasts a bit with Myzida, who is a very direct woman and not particularly feminine. It's actually one of her character flaws, is she has trouble with the stuff that women are supposed to be good at. I have a moment in one of my books where her friends like, how how's this dress look on me? And she's like, it looks great. It makes your butt look huge. And her friend's like, ah, you know. So I think it's really how you use the characters. I mean, my Win is contrasting with the much less feminine Zeta. Win's technically could be a more passive character, but she makes a difference in the scenes. I mean, if she weren't there, you know, people would be dead. There would be a lot more dead people all over the place. And she is active, and she's actually, even though she's not punchy-kicky active, she's the one who's running over and shielding the civilian. She's healing the injured. She's countering spells being cast by the enemy. Spellcaster, because I do have more than one of those. I do have a character whose powers she can are sort of based off the classic damsel in distress idea, because she really wants to be rescued by her hero. But she uses it very aggressively. She uses it to make men rescue her. She uses it to make them think huge shards of glass are attacking you. You know, that sort of thing. It's like, okay, it's a damsel in distress idea, but she is using it really aggressively. There's nothing passive about that particular one. I do have people with more passive powers. I have someone who can find lost people. It takes a lot out of him. He doesn't do it much, and he's a side character. I had to take out most of that scene because it wasn't relevant to the book, and I'm trying to get, tighter books and all that. But I do have someone with a passive power like that, and he's fun to write too. I mean, it's all what you do with it and how it fits your characters.
Awesome. Those were all really great responses. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to have you all say your names one more time, where we can find your books and your different book series. Go with CB.
Okay, I am CB Wright. The story that I write is called Curveball. Unfortunately, there are no less than 2 other series out there also with the name Curveball. I seem to run into that problem a lot. So the best place to start is to go to curveball.xyz, which is where I publish the story in serial form. And you can also go to the superherofiction.com and look me up there, and you can see the year 1 and year 2 books that I have published for the series so far. I try to emulate a comic book format when I publish. So I've got year 1, year 2, and then I've got individual issues that I publish when I finish writing them, which I'm still trying to do.
Samantha?
So I'm Samantha Bryant. I write the Menopausal Superheroes series, which is the only Menopausal Superheroes. If you Google it, you're going to find me. I'm also the second most famous Samantha Bryant. If you put in Samantha Bryant author, you get me. If you put in Samantha Bryant, you get Colin Hanks' wife, an actress. But, second most famous Samantha Bryant. You can find the Menopausal Superhero series on Amazon, at the Falstaff site, at your favorite place to buy books. They're all in Ingram, so bookstores can get them on request. And the first book is called Going Through the Change, and it's on 99-cent sale for the duration. John hasn't said when he's taking our first in series off sale, but we feel like it's a good thing to do during the pandemic to get people addicted to our books while they have time to read. And the newest release is called the Goodwill Tour. That just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's a novella. And I think they're both awesome, of course, because I wrote them. Duh.
Well, they certainly sound awesome. How about you, Karen?
Well, I'm Karen Diem. I write the Arca series, which is available pretty much at most major ebook retailers: Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, wherever, really. You can find out more info about my books, including free first chapters, at karendiem.com. Of course, there are links to my books off of superhero-fiction.com. the nice people who are hosting this convention and, invited us all to speak, even if they've been on panels with us before. Not that I'm thinking of anyone specific, but I might be.
Michael?
Okay. Michael Bailey. I write as Michael C. Bailey to differentiate myself from the horror writer, also named Michael Bailey. You can find my books on Amazon, obviously. Also sell signed print editions of all my books at infamouslook.com, where you can also read sample chapters of everything I've written. And my superhero series specifically is action figures. The first book is issue 1, Secret Origins. It's 9 books in, going on 10 next year. Probably will wrap up 7 dozen or so.
Awesome. Thank you. Lucas?
Yeah, I'm Lucas Flint. I write superhero, like mostly adult superhero books. I've written a lot, but my main series I'm probably known for the Superhero Son, young adult action adventure superhero series, and my Capes Online series. My current series right now is Tournament of Heroes, which is a big Avengers style superhero crossover trilogy, and the final book in that is coming out next month. I've also got an audiobook Kickstarter for my first superhero book, The Superheroes Test, coming to Kickstarter on May 30th. So there, you can find that on Kickstarter, and you can find links to my books, which are available on Kindle Limited, and also some of them are available on Wide, on Kobo, Apple, Nook, and so on. You can just go to my website at www.lucasflint.com. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And I'm Jeffrey H. Haskell. I write Arsenal of Full Metal Superhero and Wraith Superhero by Night. And you can find those on Amazon.com. I'd like to thank superhero-fiction.com for hosting this. And you can also find my books there, and along with a ton of superhero novels you may have not known about. And thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. You all had terrific answers to the questions, and I look forward to seeing you again.
All right. Thanks for having us.
So long, everyone.
Bye.
It was awesome.
Thank you.